I've heard knitters say before, and I myself said it before I knit my first sock, that socks were something I didn't want to tackle. When you're a beginner knitter, garments such as socks can be a little bit scary, not just because of the new elements that you might not be as familiar with, like the creases and creases and knitting in the round, but also because maybe it's harder to conceptualize how a sock is made. You have especially to think about the heel, the toes. It's a little harder if you don't really have the knowledge to picture it. But in reality, socks are not really that hard to knit once you've mastered the basic sock. And they become a blank canvas for a lot of fun stuff. And then you get really, really cool sock combinations that have really interesting patterns on it, that have really fun, colorful combinations. And also that are a small item that you can bring with you pretty much anywhere. They're very compact and easy to travel with. And it is actually kind of really fun to knit them once you get into it, and hard to stop. Anyway, if you're watching this, it's because you're already convinced that you're gonna face your fears or your skepticism and try to knit your first socks. So the purpose of this video is not only that I'm going to show you a tutorial on how to knit socks, but I'm gonna walk you through every step. I'm gonna give you tips. I'm basically gonna hold your hand through knitting your first sock so that you feel confident to go back out there and pick up any sock pattern and start getting into the sock knitting craze. For this tutorial, I'm going to be using as a base the Oh So Basic sock pattern by Summer Lee. This is a pattern, I will put the link in the description. It's a free pattern. When you are looking at the pattern, make sure to follow the right size for you. Make sure to also measure your feet or whoever's feet you're going to knit for before starting your sock pattern, just because it's might not be this, it's a lot more customizable. It might not be the same as like commercial socks. With all of that in mind, let's get started with what are the materials that you need for making your first socks. The first thing, of course, is yarn. You will find all kinds of different sock yarn out there. Usually is wool and it has some sort of nylon or polyamide combination in it. You want that because, like I said, socks are garments that get a lot of use and they get a lot of wash as well. So you want something that's gonna hold over time and that is gonna be strong enough to go on your feet. For this project, I'm trying for the first time the Friends Sock Wool by Hobby. They very nicely gifted me this yarn and I was really excited to knit socks with it. So I will be trying it for the first time. So far it looks really nice. I got 2 skeins. You wanna get about 400 yards for adult socks. So you need at least 2 of these skeins, or if you're getting different yarn, just make sure it's about 400 yards. And the color I'm using is number 60. So this is what I will be using. You can use whatever sock yarn you have in hand. Just make sure that it's sock yarn, that it has that nylon or polyamide, that it isn't 100% wool. Famously, there's also 2 ways usually in which people knit socks as it comes to needles, and that is either double pointed needles or circular needles. I really like, personally, knitting with double pointed needles for socks. If you've never used double pointed needles before, I will be walking you through the process of knitting socks with them. But if you would prefer to use circular needles, you're welcome to do that, and I will also include steps for casting on with a circular needle and do a magic loop. So you have options, and you can click on the different time codes down below if you want to jump to those specific parts. I have this set of double pointed needles from Knit Picks that has several sizes. So depending on your gauge, you can use different ones. And I like to use bamboo double pointed needles because they're not as slippery, and when you're knitting socks you don't want your stitches to come off. So this is the set that I use. It's 5 inches long, which I find is kind of like the sweet spot for the length of the double pointed needles. These are the ones I recommend. I will also put a link to them if you want to try knitting with double pointed needles. Either way, make sure you have your needles, and I will put the size information on the screen. But most importantly, as always with any knitting project, you have to get to the gauge for the pattern. Other things to have in hand before starting the project is, of course, some scrap yarn that you have left from another project, or you can use a stitch holder, and also some stitch markers. For socks, I like using these little gold ones that are very, very light, but just use whatever you have in hand. You can even use scrap yarn. And one last thing, if you're a beginner knitter, I will be using techniques such as knitting in the round, the creases, knitting, and purling. So make sure that you have at least some experience with this before you start. If you haven't, you may want to go back and find simpler projects, or you can watch along and try, but just be aware that those techniques are going to come up, and I will quickly show how to do them, but I won't go into as much detail. All right, if you have everything to get started, let's knit our first socks. All right, let's get started. Because this pattern calls for gauge of 40 stitches in the round, knit in the round and stockinette. Before, you might want to do a gauge swatch, which basically just means knitting 40 to 42 stitches on whatever your preferred needles are, and then measuring that to make sure that it's measuring to the gauge. And if that doesn't work, you have to go either one size up or one size down, depending on whether your stitches are, you have too many stitches or less stitches. If you don't know how to do a gauge swatch, definitely look into that before you get started. I will be casting on 63 stitches. Follow the size of stitches that is for you, but it is the same no matter how many you are starting. I'm going to be knitting the long tail cast on method, for which you have to leave enough of a tail before your starting point so that you can cast on those 63 stitches. I just kind of put it around my fingers a few times, and that should be more than enough, I think. So we're gonna start casting on normally with one of the needles. We will make this into the round very quickly. So just start using your cast on method that you prefer. I like doing this. If you don't know how to cast on using this long tail method, I do have a video that goes into very, very much detail on step by step how to do this. So I'm not really counting my stitches yet. I will later. I just want to make sure there are enough stitches on this first needle. Okay, that's quite a few. So the way we are going to make this into the round is by creating basically a square with our needles. And so we have to pass on the stitches to every needle so that we can create that square, which is actually going to make a circle. And so you need at least 4 needles, double pointed needles, and then a 5th one for knitting later. I'm simply going to slip them to the end of the needle and pass them on to another one. All right, so now there are some stitches left on the first needle, but they're mostly on the second needle. And I will take one more needle and pass on those stitches from the second needle to the third needle. At this point, you want to start counting how many stitches you have. And since they're going to be divided by 4, basically take the number of your cast on stitches and divide it by 4, and that's how many stitches you should have in each needle. So for example, since I'm supposed to have 63 stitches casted on, divided by 4 obviously is not an exact number, but roughly 15 stitches should be on each of these needles. So I think I need to cast on a few more. So I'm going back to my first needle and then adding more stitches. At the beginning, This can be a little messy, as you can see, because you have all these needles floating. But once you start knitting, it becomes a lot simpler. And another thing you have to watch out for is that your stitches don't get twisted in between needles. So make sure that they are staying straight, as you can see. All right, so I'm ready to pass on more stitches. And so basically I'm going to continue casting on and passing on stitches until I have 63 stitches and they are divided evenly, or as evenly as possible, between those 4 needles. We have casted on all of our stitches, and as you can see, they are divided evenly between all of our 4 needles, but they haven't been connected yet, that they are not in a round. So what we're gonna do is grab that last stitch that was casted on and then that first stitch that was casted on, and I still like to place, you don't have to if you can tell where the beginning of the round is, but I still like to place a marker at the beginning of the round like you would with knitting with with circular needles. And so basically we are just gonna knit the first stitch. Oh, and make sure that your stitches are not twisted, that everything is kind of pointing in the same direction. And I'm gonna knit that first stitch just like that at the end of the row, the round. Just gonna knit it, it's a little tight. There we go. And so that stitch is gonna live there. I'm just gonna leave it like that. Before knitting any more stitches, I'm actually gonna start using my empty needle now. We will start knitting in a knit 1, purl 1 pattern, basically a ribbing pattern, which is gonna create the ribbing at the top of the socks. So we're gonna knit the socks top down, starting with the cuff. You wanna use the 5th needle here so that you always have 4 needles in your circle. So we already knit the first stitch, and then I'm going to start by purling the first stitch. As you can see, at the beginning is a little hard to like manage all these needles together, and that's normal. It just kind of, once it starts taking shape, it becomes a lot easier and faster. So you're just gonna knit and purl to the end of this first needle. Knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. Okay, so all of my stitches have been transferred to that 5th needle, and then the needle that was holding the stitches is now empty. So this becomes now your 5th needle. And we basically just we're working with the empty needle and the needle that continues the next stitch, and you're kind of letting the rest hang. It helps to put the stitches at the middle of your double pointed needles and not leaving them at the edges so that they don't fall off, and then just kind of move them out of the way. Like I said, at the beginning this is a little awkward, but once you have a longer cuff, it becomes a lot simpler. So just go ahead and knit 1, purl 1 to the end of this needle. I promise the stitches don't fall off, especially if you're using bamboo. And once again, I get to the end of this needle. We're still in the first round. We're just going needle by needle. And now I have an empty one. I switch hands, and I'm gonna do the same up until I get to the end of my round. I am now on the last 2 stitches of the last needle. So I'm going to purl 1, knit 1 up to the very end. And then simply I'm going to pass on that stitch marker and knit that last stitch just like we did at the beginning. And we're back to the beginning. We're back to the beginning of the round. We've knit 1 full row in the round with double pointed needles in knit 2, purl 2 ribbing pattern. Hooray! So now you're just gonna continue doing the same thing, just knitting knit 2, purl 2, making sure you're following. I started with knit 1, so it's purl 1, so make sure there's always the same so that you create that ribbon pattern. And I'm going to do this for about 1 inch or however long you want that cuff with the ribbon at the beginning of your sock. Remember, this is the top of your sock. We're gonna start knitting down, and I'll catch you when I get to the 1 inch. All right, I have knit about 1 inch of the cuff. You can see how it's already forming the shape and how we are back to the beginning of the round. And simply now we're going to switch to stockinette, which is what happens when you only knit every single stitch. So we're simply going to continue as we have been going, and it's a lot easier now that I have more knitting done. And I'm just gonna go and knit every single stitch from now on. Same idea, I'm gonna knit until I finish the stitches on this one needle, and then I'm gonna have an empty needle and switch to the other hand and knit the stitches on the next needle. And I'm just gonna keep going around and around this way until I get to the beginning of the round, which will mark the first stockinette round. And this part is going to be the leg of your sock. So the length of the leg of the sock depends on how long you want your socks to be. If you want to use contrasting yarn, so if you want to switch colors at this point, and instead of continuing in the same color, just make the cuff a different color and then switch to the yarn for the leg, you can do that. I'm just gonna continue all in the same color, but you're free to switch around and experiment. So like I said, it is really customizable. If you want really long socks, if you want really short ankle socks, it's up to you the length. And this is the length of what the sock is going to be up until the heel. So in this case, I'm going to knit about 6.5 inches, which is kind of like a regular crew sock. Okay, go back to the beginning of the round. 6.5 inches is like more or less a regular crew sock, but if you want it to be longer or if you want it to be shorter, feel free to customize. If you want it to be the leg a different color from the cuff, feel free to customize. As long as you just continue knitting in the round all of your stitches. So I'll come back when I have about 6.5 stitches, and we basically just have a tube of yarn. Then we're gonna move to the heel, and that's when things start to get spicy. Okay, so I've knit about 4 inches after the ribbing, total about 5 inches. You can 5.5, something like that. You can knit more or less depending on how long you want the leg of your sock to be, but I decided that this is how long it looked good on my foot, and I am going to start knitting the heel flap. So for the heel flap, what we're going to do is divide our stitches in half. So since I already divided them evenly between my 4 stitches here, I will be knitting the heel flap basically on 2 of the needles, and then the other 2 needles are just going to be holding all the rest of the stitches while we're knitting the heel flap. If you're knitting in circle needles, basically you have to divide your stitches in half, and that's about it. So we're going to start by knitting those first 2 needles, stitches on the first 2 needles, and then we're going to start doing the heel flap. So I already knit the first stitch after my stitch marker. I'm actually going to pass that on back, and I'm going to remove the stitch marker because I'm not going to need it for right now. So I will knit again that stitch and then just knit to the end of the needle, which should be like a quarter basically of the stitches. That's the nice thing about knitting with double pointed needles. Sometimes you do less math because you did it at the beginning, and you kind of keep it going throughout when you divide them. All right, so I finished the first needle and I'm gonna knit through the second needle the same. So this part is gonna be the insole of your sock, or the top part that goes over your foot. All right, so now I'm halfway through. This is the beginning of a round, and this is gonna be my heel. So basically, these two needles I'm not gonna knit on at all. I'm just gonna start doing the heel here, and I don't really need a stitch marker. If you're knitting this in circle needles, then you might want to put these two, all the stitches, the other half of the stitches in a stitch holder or some scrap yarn. But with the double pointed needles, you can just leave them there. All right, so we're gonna start knitting our heel flap, which is gonna be what goes over your heel on the back of the sock. So we're going to start by knitting the first two stitches of the next needle. And then we are going to slip the next stitch as if to purl, meaning your needle goes in the front as if you were gonna purl, but your yarn is in the back. So as if to purl with the yarn in the back, you're just slipping the stitch, not knitting it. And then we'll knit the next stitch. So we're gonna repeat that. Slip, knit, slip, knit, all the way so until we finish the needle, or the first half of the stitches, and then I'm just going to continue. The last one was knit, so we are going to slip the next one, then knit the next one, slip, knit, until we get to the end of the second needle. We're going to make sure that the last stitch that you knit on the needle is a knit stitch. So then we're going to turn our work around to work on the wrong side of the fabric to continue the heel flap, and we will be working back and forth from now on until we finish the heel flap. So then our first stitch from the wrong side is going to be a slip with the yarn in the front. And now we're going to continue purling every single stitch. I purl continental, which is why it might look a little different than the way you purl. But you're just going to purl all the way back the first and second needles that will make the heel flap. So here I'm finishing the first one. And then I am going to continue on the second needle of this heel flap. There we go. So once again, I will turn my work around. And you can also put all of your stitches in for the heel flap in one needle if that makes it easier, if you don't want to have like that kind of space in the middle. Just gotta make sure that there's enough space for your stitches to fit, which should be. So I'm gonna do that. I'm just going to, on the next round, I'm gonna knit through, but instead of switching needles, I'm just gonna keep going on the same needle, and I'll show you what that looks. If you're knitting circle needles, which is just continuing on the circle needle, doesn't really matter. But okay, so the next row is gonna be the front row going forward for all of the heel flap. So we're simply going to slip one with the yarn in the back like we did before, and knit one, and then just continue doing that. So it's basically the same as before, just slip one, knit one. And now you'll see, to put all the stitches on the same needle, I'm gonna put this needle away, and then I'm just gonna continue on that second needle and keep going. So the next one is a slip one, knit one, slip one, one. I'll just keep going. And the heel flap stitches, because of that slip one, are a little tighter than your stockinette stitches, so they should be able to fit in one needle. So there we go. Now all my stitches are in one needle. It'll be easier to just go back and forth just on this needle to knit the heel flap. So I'm going to turn my work around again, and I'm going to repeat what I did before. I'm going to slip the first stitch and then purl all of the stitches. And I'm basically going to repeat these 2 rows back and forth until my heel flap measures about 2 inches. It kind of depends on the length of your sock. 2 to 2.5 inches. I will put the measurements on screen. And once you have completed that length, just make sure that you finish right after a purl row so that you're facing forward, and that's where we will meet for finishing the heel flap. All right, so I've knitted the heel flap for just over 2 inches long, like 2.25 inches, and this is what it looks like. This is what the pattern that the slip one knit one creates, and this is the back side of the wrong side of the fabric. So this is what we're going to knit now, is the heel turn, which is just basically doing short rows. Don't be scared. I'll take you step by step. It's quite easy, and it's gonna create like the 3D bottom of the heel flap, of the heel on the sock. So you have to start on the right side of your fabric, so you should be looking at this side. So we're not gonna knit on this pattern anymore. We're gonna go back to stockinette, meaning knitting every stitch except for the first one, which will slip. But it'll depend on how many stitches you have. You're basically gonna knit to the halfway point of the number of stitches you have. So that for me is gonna be 14 stitches. So I'm gonna slip the first stitch and then knit 14. All right, so I am on that halfway point, and now I'm going to do a decrease, which is the SSK, or slip slip knit. So if you don't know how to do the creases, I'll show you really quick. But basically you're going to slip this next stitch as if to knit, as if you were going to knit it, but you slip it. Then do the same thing with the second stitch, slip as if to knit. And then with your left needle, you're going to return those 2 stitches back and then knit them together. And there is the decrease. So now I'm going to knit 1. And instead of continuing to knit, I'm going to turn to the wrong side of the work. Then we're going to slip that first stitch that I just knit, and we're going to purl 5 stitches. 3, 4, 5. And now we're going to do a decrease on the wrong side, which is going to be purl 2 together, which is just what it sounds like. You are going to purl the next 2 stitches as if it was 1 together, and that's a decrease. Then you're going to purl the next stitch, and once again you're going to turn back to the right side. Okay, so we're creating these back and forth of decreases. So on the third row, we're gonna slip the first stitch again, and now we're gonna knit 6 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So basically what we're doing is knitting to 1 stitch before there's a gap from when we turned. And now we're going to repeat the slip slip knit decrease using this stitch and closing this gap. So slip 1, knit together. See, now the gap is gone. We're going to knit 1 more, and once again turn our stitches. Now we're going to slip again the first stitch as if to purl, and then purl 7 stitches. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And just like before, we purl to 1 stitch before that gap, and we're going to purl those together to close the gap. We're going to purl the next stitch, and turn. So we're going to continue doing this basically until there are no more stitches to knit. So it's the same idea. You always slip the first stitch, you continue knitting until you find yourself to one stitch before the gap. Here's one stitch before the gap, and then you're going to knit those stitches together, knit the next stitch, and purl and turn your work. And back and forth the same way, slipping the first stitch, purling until we get to the gap. When we get to one stitch before the gap, same thing, we purl it together, we purl the next one. As you can see, you're getting closer and closer to knitting basically every single stitch, but you're going to continue in that pattern back and forth. Knit to the gap, slip them together, knit one, and turn. So you see how this is creating kind of like a three-dimensional heel shape here, and it's going to continue doing that until we've knit all of our stitches. Because we're done with the heel turn. It should look something like this, kind of like a triangle shape. And then we're done with the heel flap, and we should be able to start the gusset. The gusset is basically the way that the sock is together. Like when you see a finished sock, there's like a line that is joining the heel with the insole. So that's what we're gonna do. And to do that, we're basically gonna pick up stitches on this side flap on both sides. So before we do that, if you're knitting with double pointed needles, you're gonna take these stitches, which you should have this number of stitches right now on your heel flap. You should take them and you're going to put half of them back on your other needle, so that we have 4 needles again like we did before. So I'm just going to do that really quickly. So there's roughly half of the stitches on each needle, and then starting from where your stitches are attached kind of to the yarn, to where you ended, we're going to start picking up the stitches on the side here. So to do that, we're basically going to pick up here. It's kind of hard to see, but there is like a little cord at the very end of your flap. So you're going to be picking up the stitches there and then knitting them as you go. So you're going to take your other needle and you're going to pick up one of the stitches on the side and then knit it and add it to your needle. So you're going to keep doing that, and you're going to pick up this number of stitches from the heel flap so that you end up with enough stitches on each side. So it's like basically you're looking at the side, picking up a stitch and then knitting it, picking up a stitch and knitting them. And as you can see, it starts to kind of connect the heel flap. Once you've picked up the number of stitches you're supposed to pick, your needle should look something like this. And before we continue knitting on this side, I'm actually going to bring back one of my stitch markers, and I'm going to place it here, and then I'm going to knit one stitch. And that's just so that I remember that this is where the gusset is kind of joining the heel and the insole. And then I'll continue knitting on my next needle from the front, as the ones that we had left on hold. If you're doing this with circular needles, you are gonna have to put these stitches back on your needle and then knit off of them. So I'm just gonna knit through all of the stitches from the front of the sock. And when you get to the last stitch, this is basically back to the beginning of the round. And we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna put a stitch marker and we're gonna pick up the stitches. So for this side, it'll be easier if you pick up the stitches first and then knit them. You could do either way. You could do what we were doing or before, or you can go ahead and pick them directly on to your needle. Just make sure they are the same number of stitches as on the other side. And then once you pick all of them up, you place your beginning of round marker and you knit them just like we have done. So I'm just picking along the edge. So you always pick up instead of down so that the stitches kind of are correct and not twisted. So see how I go down, under, and then up. I've picked all my stitches up on the side and I'm gonna place my beginning of round marker. I made a different one so I know that this is the beginning of round and it's different from this other marker. And then, well, I'm gonna knit one stitch and leave it next to the marker. And then I'm just gonna continue knitting on the side of the sock. And now we're gonna go all the way around, even after I finish this heel picked up stitches. And we're going to do basically one round all the way so that we've knit all of our stitches once. So I'm going to keep knitting to the end of this needle. There we go. And now you can see how the sock is connected and see how it sort of looks a little floppy because we have way too many stitches at the moment. But you can see the shape already. This is the leg, here's the heel, and this is going to be the insole. So we need to make that gusset, which is going to get rid of all those extra stitches that we picked up and basically go back to the number of stitches that we started with. So like I said, we're gonna keep knitting all the way around and just stockinette until I return to my beginning of round marker, and then we're gonna do the gusset decreases. So for the decreases on the gusset, we are going to start on the beginning of round. So you've knit all across the front of the foot and you slip that stitch marker. So now we're going to do some decreases. So we're going to start by knitting that last stitch, the first stitch after the marker, leaving it there. And then we are going to do the slip, slip, knit two together through the back loop, slip, slip, knit, and then we're going to continue knitting all the way around to the next marker. Okay, so we knit all the way around and we're gonna knit until 3 stitches before the next marker, and then basically just gonna knit this two together, the next 2 stitches together, and then knit one and slip the marker and continue knitting. So I will knit all the way through the front of the foot again without any decreases until I get to the other marker. When I get to the other marker, I'm gonna slip it, and now I'm gonna knit another round all the way around to this marker without doing any decreases. So we're gonna alternate to 1 row without decreases, just knit every stitch, and 1 row with the same decreases. So they're always the first one right after this beginning of round marker, and then the last one before the next marker. So they're always happening here on the gusset, alternating 1 round with no decreases at all and 1 round with decreases. And we're going to keep doing this until our sock has just as many stitches as it had when we casted it on. So however many stitches you cast it on are the same number that should be on the foot, and you should stop doing the creases once you get to that point. So make sure that you're counting your stitches. So after doing the decreases, this is what the gusset should look like. As you can tell, we've got our heel flap, the heel turn, and then here's where we picked up our stitches. And as we decrease, we created that kind of triangle shape that connects our sock to our lower part of the sock to the leg. And now we're back to the same number of stitches as what we had for the leg part, and all we have left is knitting the rest of the sock, kind of like the foot part of it. And I have it divided into my 4 needles. I'm back to like the original number of stitches, and I'm simply going to keep knitting and stockinette. No more decreases now that I've reached the desired number of stitches. And I'm going to keep knitting for about a few inches. It depends on the size of the sock you want to make. You can try on the sock and knit until it gets to your toe start, about 1.5 to 1.25 inches, about 3 centimeters before the end of the sock. There are also some, if you're not knitting for yourself, you're knitting for someone else, there are also some measurements that are the standard for foot size. I will put them on screen. So if you want to knit any of these sizes, you can knit to that number of inches minus 1.25 inches so that you can do the toe. So that's what we're going to do now. Just keep on knitting, and I'll catch you after I have knit long enough for my own socks. Once you've knitted enough of your foot that you are only about 2.25 inches for the toes, as you can see, I knitted about 6.5 inches, so I'm gonna add an 1.25 inches to that, and that's my sock size. And it should be looking something like this. So you're gonna make sure that you mark the halfway point. In our case, after 2 needles, this is the halfway point from the beginning of round. If you're knitting on circular needle, you can place a marker there. And we're going to create the decreases around the beginning of round and around that other middle point or marker. We're gonna start all the decreases. You can switch colors if you want at this point, if you wanted the toe to have a different color. So I'm going to knit the first stitch, which I already did right after my marker. The first decrease is a slip, slip, knit 2 together through the back loop. And then we're going to knit to 3 stitches before that halfway point. So I'm going to knit all through my first needle. And then I'm going to knit on my second needle to 3 stitches before, or if you have that marker, 3 stitches before the marker. Now that I'm 3 stitches before that halfway point, I'm going to knit 2 together. You can see a little better. Knit this 2 stitches together, and then knit 1. And I'm exactly at the halfway point. If you have a marker, then you would slip the marker. So now we're going to repeat the first decrease that we did. So we'll knit 1 and then slip, slip, knit 2 together. There we go. And basically we're going to do the same. We're going to knit all the way to the end of this needle and then do 3 stitches before the beginning of the round. 3 stitches before the beginning of round, and again I will knit 2 together and knit 1 and slip that marker. I'm gonna knit my first stitch just so that I have the marker secure. After that first round of decreases, we are simply going to knit another round where we do nothing but knit stitches. So we don't do any decreases in this round. And we are going to continue in this pattern, doing 1 round with the decreases at each side of the sock, and then 1 round just knit all stitches. We're going to continue doing this until you have this number of stitches, depending on your size, And that will be the end of our sock. So make sure to try it on when you get to that point. If the sock is not fitting, or if it's not measuring what you want it to measure for whoever you're making it for, then you are gonna have to go back and knit a few more rounds of stockinette of the foot to make it longer. But I'm just gonna continue knitting all the way around until I get back to my beginning of round, and then I will do another round of decreases and so on. So I'll come back when I have my decreases done. After you've finished all of your decreases and you've gotten to the number of stitches that you need to be at, your sock should look like something like this. You can see the decreases on the side and how it kind of creates that sock shape. I also tried on my sock at this point to make sure that it actually fit and everything was great. So I removed my beginning of round marker, and I am going to put all of my stitches in 2 needles only, which should be easy because there's not that many. Like that. Move this one, and then I'm gonna put the other stitches into another needle. If you're working with circular needles, you would do the same thing with your 2 needles. You really need to have your needle set up like this. I'm going to turn it around so you can see. So this is the yarn that is attached to my working yarn, and I want to create this separation. So if I had circular needles, I would do the same thing, just that the circular cable would go here, but otherwise I want them to be pointing towards the yarn. And what we're going to do to close this is use the Kitchener stitch to graft these stitches together. If you've never used a Kitchener stitch, I'm going to show you how to do it. It's pretty easy. All you need, other than having your stitches set up like this and have even number of stitches on each needle, we're going to start by cutting our working yarn, and you are also going to need a tapestry needle like this one, so that, like the kind you would use to weave ends. So we're going to take our tapestry needle and we are going to insert the tail of the yarn, and we're going to start grafting these together. So again, starting, you will see that your yarn that is attached to the needle is on the back needle with your stitches, and then you have the front needles parallel to it. So first we're going to set this up, and we will do that by inserting the needle with the yarn on the first stitch of the front needle as if you were going to purl, which means this is your stitch and you're going to insert it from right to left as if to purl, and then just going to pull it through. And now you're going to go to the first stitch on your back needle, and you're going to insert the needle as if you were going to knit this stitch. So from left to right, like that, and you're just going to pull it. So that is the setup. Now we're going to actually start grafting the needles and basically casting them off. So we're going to insert through that first stitch again. So remember, you didn't drop the stitches when you were doing that. You left them on the needles. Now we are going to insert on the front as if to knit. And this time I will drop that stitch and kind of pull it a little bit. And then I'm going to insert onto the next stitch that is now the first stitch on the needle as if to purl. All right, so now I'm going back to that first stitch on the back needle, and I'm going to insert my needle as if to purl, like that, and I am going to drop it off the needle. And then I'm going to insert onto the next stitch on my back needle as if to knit, and not drop that stitch. So we're going to go back and forth like that, repeating that same pattern. So we always start at the front as if to knit, drop that stitch, then insert on the next stitch as if to purl, and then go to the back as if to purl again, drop that stitch, and then insert onto the next stitch as if to knit. So I'm going to go back and forth like this. Once you finish that last, as if that last stitch on the back, you are back at the beginning and you repeat everything. So knit, drop off the stitch as if to purl, leave the stitch on the needle, as if to purl on the back, drop that stitch, as if to knit. Once you kind of get the rhythm of it, it becomes easier. And as you can see, we're starting to cast off the stitches one by one. So again, as if to knit, knitwise, drop, purlwise, don't drop, back needle, purlwise, drop, knitwise, don't drop, repeat again, knitwise, drop, purlwise, don't drop, purlwise, drop, knitwise, don't drop. So you're basically going to repeat that until you've gone through every single one of your stitches and you have no more stitches left. Once you get to the last two stitches, we're going to do the same thing. I'm first going to cast off the front one. So I'm going to go knitwise, remove it, purlwise, remove it, and we're done. That is the end of the sock. All you have left to do now is to weave in your end. Since we're right at this end, I like to weave it onto this side of the sock, just to make sure that there's no like a bump there. And otherwise, once you're done weaving all of your ends, you should have your sock all finished. It should look something like this. So we're gonna weave these ends that you shouldn't have any more other than that, unless you change colors and you have a different color at the toe or a different color on any part of your sock, then you should be able to also weave those. But other than that, you're done with your first sock. Congratulations. If you want it to look nicer, it's okay. You can wear it just like that, or you can gift it just like that. If you want to look nicer and make it look a little more professional, you can block your socks. The next part of this video is going to be how to knit, how to cast on your sock with a circular needle. So you can skip that onto the blocking of the socks if you prefer. Now this is an option if you want to use circular needles instead of double pointed needles. It doesn't really matter how long they are because we're going to be using the magic loop technique, but just make sure that they are needles that are for the right size, the same gauge as what you would do with the double pointed needles. So I'm going to start by casting on the number of stitches that I need that are the same number of stitches that I casted on my other sock. I'm going to be knitting my second sock using the magic loop technique. I have videos on how to cast on using this technique. If you don't know how to do it, you can also use a different cast on technique that you feel more comfortable with, or that looks better, looks a lot cleaner, like the tubular cast on. This one's just the easiest and the fastest for me, so I like to use this one. So just cast all of your stitches. So once you've casted on all of the stitches onto the one needle, what we're gonna do is join in the round, and to do that I'm just gonna slip all the stitches to the cable, and then I'm gonna kind of divide them in half roughly, and then on that halfway point I'll just pull the cable through from both sides. So the idea is that I'm passing on the stitches to either side of the needle like this. Just pull, pull, pull. So as you can see, now my stitches are roughly half of them on one side, half of them on the other side. And I'm going to join them in the round. I'm going to make sure that all of the stitches are pointing inwards. But what I mean by that is that you can see how the bottom of the stitch with the cast on edge is all facing each other the same direction, so that we don't have twisted stitches once we join. And I'm going to grab a beginning of round marker and put it on the first stitch, before the first stitch. So that's where like both of my yarn tails are. And at this point, obviously it's too tight to knit. So here's where the magic loop technique comes in. I am going to pull this needle out and leave that on the cable so that I have more space to actually knit. And I'm going to knit that first stitch. So as you can see, it just helps, again, making sure that they're not twisted. It helps pull onto the first stitch there. So I'm going to knit that first stitch and kind of pull it so it's not too long. And then I'll pull it onto the cable too. That first stitch, just so that things are joined and there's no like a big gap there. So now I'm going to begin knitting the ribbing for the ribbing at the beginning of the sock. And that means the next stitch is a purl. So again, pulling, making sure that they're still together, but pulling that right needle so you have enough space with your cable. I'm going to purl that first stitch and then knit, then purl, knit, purl. So this is going to be just a knitting and purling pattern for the ribbing. And I'm going to continue this way until all of the stitches on this needle have been worked. Okay, now I'm getting to the last stitch on this needle. And as you can see now, they've all transferred to this stitch and they're all still on the cable. So what I'm simply going to do is slide the stitches that stayed on the cable. Slide them, slide them, slide them until they are back on the left needle again. And that way we always have our little circle here for our sock, no matter how long this cable is or how long the needles are. So we're just gonna pull these new needles to the edge of the left one, and like before, I'm gonna grab my right needle and then just pull it out to leave those stitches on the cable while I work here, and to have enough space to pull my needle and start knitting. So the last stitch was a knit stitch, so now we're gonna do purl again. Purl, knit, purl, knit, and that's it. That's how you're gonna work the entire sock. You're simply going to pull your needle and pull your stitches to the left needle whenever you need them and work them. We're gonna keep kneading the ribbing until it's about an inch or an inch and a half, however long you want the ribbing to be. Just continuing the same pattern of knitting and purling. I'm gonna slip that stitch and then knit the stitch after the beginning of round, so it's the first stitch. And once again, all of my stitches on the left. So yeah, I'm gonna continue doing that, just pulling my stitches onto the needle that I need. So now you should go back to the instructions where I teach you how to knit the rest of the sock. I will be using double pointed needles, but again, you should use this magic loop technique and just use the whatever needles you're more comfortable with. If you want to use circular needles, the instructions are exactly the same, simply using magic loop technique.
To block your socks, all you need is a bowl of water and some wool wash. You can also skip the wool wash and just use water. And you're going to submerge your sock or socks into the water completely and leave it there for about 20 minutes at least. After 20 minutes, you're going to take the sock out and put it on a towel so that you can get all the water out of it as much as possible. It's not soaking wet. Then you can use either a sock blocker like this. I have a wooden one that shapes it, or you can put it just on a mat and let it dry overnight, or it might take a couple days for it to completely dry. And this is how a block sock looks versus a non-block sock. They both fit fine. They're both fine. It's just a matter of looks and looking a little more professional. So this is an optional step, but I do prefer blocking my socks.